By devoting just 6 minutes each weekday for 1 year, you can read through the entire New Testament using David's servant's daily devotional, HeavenWord Daily. Order your copy at heavenword.tv.
So here in Acts chapter 14, once again, the crowds who have seen this marvelous miracle performed at the command of the Apostle Paul have assigned to him the title Hermes, and to his traveling companion Barnabas they decided that he's Zeus. And they're saying the gods have become like men, and they're with us now. And so, of course, this was very distressing to Paul and Barnabas. They were there to preach the gospel, to introduce Jesus Christ to these pagans who were followers of and believers in the Greek gods. And so verse number 14 of Acts chapter 14. And when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of it, they tore their robes, which would be a symbol of their great distress and alarm to convey to the crowds, and rushed out into the crowd, crying out and saying, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you in order that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them." Now, I skipped over one verse, or just part of this passage in verse number 13. The thing that really alarmed Barnabas and Paul was not just that the people were calling them Zeus and Hermes, but in verse number 13, I did not read this. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifices with the crowds. And so, they want to make sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas as if they are gods. So you can see why this was so distressing, so alarming to these ministers of the gospel. I think it's interesting that even within the false religions and so forth of history, they have the element of animal sacrifice. That, of course, predates the law of Moses. We find even Noah sacrificing animals, early on in the book of Genesis and others. Even with Cain and Abel, bringing a sacrifice to the Lord. And so I believe that's something that was probably taught by God. I can't imagine why somebody would just think that and say, well, let's kill an animal as a part of our religion to God. I mean, we do know that God clothed Adam and Eve with garments of animal skins. And so that implies that animals had to die. We're not given any information in those early chapters of Genesis about the actual killing of those animals, but I think it's safe to assume animals died. Did Adam and Eve know that? I think they're smart to figure it out. If God's clothing them with animal skins, this looks like it used to be on a camel or a sheep or whatever. Well, sheep or a camel died. And it seems that we have the genesis of the whole sacrificial system there. And I'm persuaded, and I think we have scriptural reason to be persuaded this way, that to the degree that God did institute animal sacrifice, of course we know he did in the law of Moses. We know there's all kinds of messianic symbolism within that, on the Day of Atonement when they lay their hands and part their guilt upon the scapegoat and then lead it out in the wilderness, and the other one they kill and so forth. I mean, surely that all points to Christ, whom the New Testament says is our Passover, and there's another animal sacrifice there on Passover. And then for all the various sins, the atonement for the sins, animal sacrifice. But predating the law, all that, to whatever degree that has its origin in what God taught Adam and Eve and subsequent generations, it's there to point them to what Christ would ultimately do. Because how can an animal atone for the sins of a human being? New Testament says actually that's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. But you can understand how the death of the Son of God, the creator and maker of all things in the form of man, how that could have a great value, much greater value compared to an animal, and how God dying for the sins of everybody could atone for everyone's sins. Right? So I said all that to say this: even within the Greek religion and mythology, they, tried to show their devotion to the various false gods in which they believe by sacrificing animals. Okay, missing the point though altogether as to really what's going on there, pointing them to the fact that one day God Himself would become a man and give His life and atone for our sins. But you see that element of the gospel even in their utter ignorance and in their idolatry is what it amounts to, okay? And so Paul continues speaking to the crowds in verse number 16 as he's trying to convey some truth to them about the true and the living God. And in the generations gone by, He permitted all the nations to go their own ways, which, certainly He did. But yet, Paul goes on, and yet He did not leave Himself without witness. That is, He wasn't hiding somewhere. It wasn't like He was uninvolved in the affairs of mankind. Paul gives one example of God's involvement in human activity in that He did good. And then he defines it more specifically, and gave you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. How many people, within the pagan world are really thankful for those things and then look to God in gratitude that, wow, He's provided all these things for us? How many of us, admittedly, take so much of the good things that God has provided for us for granted, even things that He provided for us, before we knew Him and when we were still yet His enemies? Well, Paul does his best and Barnabas does his best, but verse 18, even saying these things, they with difficulty restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. And so, wow, what a frustrating moment that would have been for those two apostles. And but yet, God's done a miracle. They've got people's attention, and so people ought to be listening to these guys. They must have something going for them, in light of the miracle that's been performed. Now, we come to verse number 19, which is a new paragraph, according to the New American Standard Bible. It certainly seems like some time has passed, and a major question is raised by what we read in verse number 19. We're out of time for this segment, so we'll hold right there. See you next time. Thanks for joining me.
HeavenWord 7 is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you. Thank you.